Hello, everyone, and welcome to the panel on teaching space law, an American experience. Although its title is somewhat of a misnomer because we have the good luck to be joined by a professor, not from the United States, but all the way from the other hemisphere, from Australia. So I will get to introducing our panelists in a moment, but this is a panel to explore and explain how to learn about the law of outer space and how it is taught in the United States and indeed around the world. And it has grown in proportions, just as so many aspects of the world and the industry of outer space has grown. We've all been witness to the evolution of the space industry and the emergence of space companies of a variety of different flavors. And as those space companies take their place on the world stage, the need to regulate them has also increased. And of course, the companies need lawyers in order to help them navigate the regulatory landscape, which at times can be quite complicated in that it's multidimensional. It is international in nature primarily, but also domestic and regional. And when you talk about the United States, you'll even have different state laws that, for example, apply to the limitation of liability for suborbital space tourism operators. So it has evolved as the space industry has evolved. And not only do companies need lawyers to help them navigate the regulatory landscape, but the agencies that regulate these companies also have been expanding. For example, the FAA here in the United States, which grants licenses to launch companies, they've received more applications than ever. And so it has become somewhat of a bottleneck, and the solution to that is to hire more lawyers. But I don't want to give the misconception that lawyers are only needed for the private industry and to make outer space safe for corporations. Lawyers play a critical role in assuring that there's law and order in outer space. And so we have lawyers who are experts in public policy that assist in crafting the laws of outer space, particularly necessary in the international sphere as we move mankind into orbit and beyond. We want to make sure that we avoid the conflict and the other travails of terrestrial life. And so that falls to lawyers to help to determine those rules. And although the entrepreneurs do an extraordinary job and the engineers in developing the technology that allows us to leave our planet, lawyers have, I'd have to say, an equally important role. And in some ways, it's hard to believe, but in some ways it's more difficult than what the engineers do. It's often the lawyers who are lagging, and I encourage all of our lawyers to pick up the pace and make sure that we lay out the law that will help with the work of the engineers and entrepreneurs. So we're going to talk about the training of the next generation of space lawyers, for which there is a need. And there are limited places where it's done, but that has been changing, that has been evolving. And we're here to explain the experience and who it is that's seeking an education in space law and how we offer it, and how that experience has been evolving through the years. So let me get to the invitations. And before I go any further, I want to thank you all for coming and attending this panel. We're here for you, of course, and we hope that you will ask questions as well. We have Daniel here to moderate audience questions, and we certainly will be leaving plenty of time for that towards the end of our hour. So my plan is to introduce our panelists and allow them to make a presentation, and I will press them with some questions that hopefully help to reveal what it is they do and what their thoughts on the teaching of space law are. And then we'll get to the audience. So let me start with our distinguished professors who have joined us here today. And I'll exclude myself from those ranks, but you may be curious who I am. So I'll introduce myself. I'm Mark Sundahl, and I am a professor of law at Cleveland State University's Cleveland Marshall College of the Law, where I also am the director of the Global Space Law Center, which is the only space law center in the United States that's dedicated exclusively to the study of space law. And I have worked in the field for close to 20 years, having written my first piece when I was just a law student on liability from unidentified orbital debris. And I've touched on many areas of space law since then. In the course of this presentation, I will tell you more about the curriculum and the program at Cleveland Marshall College of the Law, which, as you may have guessed, is located in Cleveland, Ohio, right on the border of Canada. But I am merely the moderator today. I would like to thank our participating panelists, and I'd like to begin with the most distinguished Professor Stephen Freeland of the University of Western Sydney. But he has not only taught law there for many years, but has taught in many places. I could list a few of them, from Bond University to the University of Copenhagen, University of Vienna, Toulouse, France, McGill University, the University of Hong Kong, London. You get the picture. He has a long and illustrious history in space law, and as you may or may not know, the Australian Space Agency has really been surging forward and was created not too long ago, although they have a much longer history of involvement with space law. And Stephen has been instrumental, Professor Freeland, in the drafting of the National Space Law and the creation of the Australian Space Agency. So Stephen, thank you for joining us all the way from Sydney, where I know that you are about 12 or 13 hours different from us. So wonderful to have you on board. On my screen, beneath Stephen is Professor Michael Dodge. So I'd like to introduce Michael, who is also a distinguished professor, an assistant professor, where he teaches space law. At the University of North Dakota, program of space law studies, which is well known in the United States, and I'm sure that the world around, for its space curriculum, which covers a variety of topics, as does space law. It is a massive umbrella of a variety of different topics that will eventually cover everything that terrestrial law covers, only when it takes place in outer space. So we're fortunate to have Professor Dodge here. And I should say that one of the extraordinary parts of Professor Dodge's resumes is that he was the first graduate of the University of Mississippi to receive a certificate, a formal certificate in the field of remote sensing, air, and space law. And so he's truly a pioneer and has gone on then to join academia. So welcome, Michael. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Yes, I look forward to handing the podium over to you, gentlemen. But we have three other panelists, Stephen Robeson, Scott Perry, and Ms. Hailey Hillsman, all of whom are or have been students of space law. Stephen is a recent graduate and has a background of employment in NASA, as well as a military background, and is currently on the verge of moving into a formal position in the field of space law. And Scott Perry is also a former student of mine, but all three of these are former students of mine, so I'm very proud to have them here today. Scott Perry was a student of mine, but then also went on to earn a master's degree at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, where they have a cyber law and space law program, which is headed by one of the greatest space lawyers alive today, and that is Professor Franz von der Donk. So he was a student of both mine and Professor von der Donk. So it's good to have you here. And now Scott is a practicing attorney, and I am encouraging him to fill one of the positions that is available in the field of space law. And the most recent student of space law, or someone who's currently a student of space law, is Hailey Hillsman. Good to have you here, Hailey. She is she's a member of the Student Staff Research Council at my Global Space Law Center and has already been writing works for publication and is currently working both on the regulation of suborbital tourism as well as the need, as we all saw just this past week, the need for regulation of orbital tourism. So thank you for joining us, Hailey. So with that somewhat long-winded introduction, I apologize for that, but when you have illustrious guests, the introductions are long. And at this point, I'd like to give both of our professors 10 minutes to explain their history and their program and their views on the teaching of space law. Stephen, please take the podium.
Oh, thank you, Mark. Hello, everybody. It's just a pleasure to be here. It's just after 7 a.m. in Sydney, Australia. I was saying to the colleagues before we started, this is my, I think, 15th week of lockdown. And so the joy of wearing headphones is it keeps your hair down, because I very much have a lockdown haircut at the moment. And so I'm very pleased that you can't see all of that. Thank you so much, Mark, for that really kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to speak to all of you and to meet the colleagues from the wonderful Global Space Law Center at Cleveland. Obviously, I'm not going to talk from an American perspective. I've taught in America, but others on the panel obviously have much more experience. What I want to do very briefly is talk from a global perspective about the study of law generally and how that fits in with the importance and the necessity for the study of space law. In the end, even though Mark said space is about everything, and I do a lot of work for the UN, I do a lot of work for governments, I do a lot of work for industry. I'll also focus on, because I suspect that some of the audience be interested in commercial space law as well, and I heard that a couple of our panelists are as well. I'll just focus on the fact that more and more every lawyer will have to be, to a greater or lesser degree, a space lawyer. Because space is so ubiquitous, space is everywhere. And it's also an exciting time for space. You mentioned orbital and suborbital tourism. It was pointed out to me last week that humanity set a record for the number of people in Earth orbit last week. There were 14 at one stage, 7 on the space station, 4 on the Inspiration 4, and 3 Chinese taikonauts. 14 people in Earth orbit, a record for humanity. And we're building and continually building a vibrant space ecosystem around us that provides opportunities. It provides risks. The risks need to be managed. And that part of that management, although of course it's only one piece of it, but part of that management is through law, and the global legal environment is, if I may say, becoming more extraterrestrial, and lawyers need to be prepared for that. So let's look at the broader context first and then filter down to space, because clearly, for all the reasons you understand, and I think the COVID situation that we've all been facing even highlights this more. The world is getting smaller, but it's becoming more complex. The world is more globalized. For lawyers, we need to understand that there's an intersection of so many areas that, at first glance might be unconnected with the study of law, but in fact are areas that law is very much dependent upon. So I've thought about what lawyers need to know to meet the challenges of the 21st century. This generation of lawyers that Hailey and Scott and Stephen are a part of, and you, Mark and Michael, because you're both much younger than me, that the lawyers, to face the challenges, I think, need to be aware of a whole range of factors. And I'll just give you a little laundry list. And you'll notice, even though I only mentioned space very briefly in this list, the study of space law is relevant to each one of these things. So here's my laundry list. Lawyers will need to understand the fundamentals of other disciplines: politics, commerce, finance, culture, Indigenous rights. They'll need to understand how the disciplines impact upon law, how they're affected by law. They'll need to understand how international norms develop. They'll need to understand how those norms impact on and are impacted by national frameworks, vice versa. They'll need to understand the continuing internationalization of human activity, the fact that we're focusing more on issues of global concern, from international criminal justice to all issues about the global commons to humanitarian issues, and of course, our adventures in space. They'll need to understand the differences and similarities between different systems of law, between civil precepts of law and common law precepts and Islamic law precepts and other precepts of law, particularly in view of the divergence and the convergence of dispute resolution norms. They'll need to understand mechanisms for international and transnational dispute resolutions. They'll need to understand the changing nature and dynamics of the political system, geopolitics, national politics, economic forces, and how they impact on sustainable development. They'll need to understand the culture, focus, and imperative of multiculturalism, even in the face of the terrestrial geopolitical tensions we have. Having said that, they will also need to understand and learn from the experience we already have in multilateral regulation, including, of course, the regulation of space through the system we have, particularly through the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. That's a daunting list. Each one of those, as I say, is relevant and is covered by programs such as Michael's, such as Mark's, and they need to be covered. It's crucial for law school curricula to be constantly assessed, revised, so that the students can learn how they must constantly adapt to these changes. The world is moving so quickly in so many ways. I know that sounds like a cliche, but we see it all the time. Who would have thought we would be in the situation today, a mere 2 years ago, that we are with everything that's happened in the world? Technology changes, politics, obviously the medical situation, market forces, socio-economic developments, all of these natures that push towards this notion of globalization. So these challenges are challenges for all of us, for humankind. And I think the trend is irreversible. Lawyers will have to become much broader in their perspectives. And the educative process, the teaching process, will have to adapt to equip those lawyers to operate as effectively as possible in that changing environment, in the context of all of these changes. So as I said, moving to space, all of those observations are relevant. Space, as I said, is ubiquitous. You and I use it every day. I'm only able to talk to you here at this moment because of space. Every culture, every economy, every community is reliant on continuous and uncompromised access to space assets. A theoretical, and there have been various studies done, a day without space would be a disaster, not just for the military who have conducted those studies, and it would be a disaster for them, but a day without space would be a disaster for lives, livelihoods, economies, and the global community. And all of these technological advancements that are making space so crucial to our critical infrastructure, many of them are driven, most of them are driven by the private sector and facilitated through a global space economy, which at the moment is valued at, people say, somewhere in excess of $400 billion annually. But the interesting thing is that global economy is growing exponentially. It's growing at 3 or 4 or 5 times the world economy. And that was even before COVID. During COVID, the space economy, along with pharmaceuticals and the digital economies, continued to grow. It is so important. So as a general observation, and Mark said, lawyers will be an important cog in ensuring that those wheels move smoothly. They're not the only cog, of course, but they're an important cog. And in a sense, and this is a general observation, which is so pertinent to the panelists, because they will be in a different situation. But my general observation that even as we access space as never before, the unique nature of space, which then translates to the unique nature of the commercial aspects of space-related transactions, remain pretty poorly understood by lawyers. For example, to a greater or lesser degree, depending on the relevant jurisdiction, standard procurement contracts, for example, that are mandated by corporations and by governments have been designed for terrestrial transactions. You would understand that. And in terrestrial transactions, the technicians are motivated by carrots and sticks, legal carrots and sticks. They're rushed to the scene when there's a failure with their legal toolboxes in hand, you know, warranties. Well, where are the warranties? Why haven't they been fulfilled, etc.? This, perhaps unsurprisingly, doesn't make much sense when the object or the activity is located in space. The risks in outer space are very different from those on Earth and are managed by different legal structures in contracts. The focus, if you like, is less about punishing failures and more about using insurance efficiently. Space contracts and terrestrial contracts have different legal philosophies that are difficult sometimes to reconcile in negotiations. And that, in effect, has sometimes deterred some organizations from using space-based systems because they just can't find a way to fit that square peg into their traditional round hole of contractual negotiations and structures. So the past reluctance of some to engage in space, as they must, sometimes has stemmed, I say, from a lack of space literacy by lawyers. That's understandable, but it's unfortunate given how important space has become and how we all benefit from space. So our lives and our economies are being transformed and have great potential to continue to be transformed by all sorts of technologies: commercial spaceports, launch vehicles, spacecraft, Internet of Things constellations, remote sensing capabilities, propulsion systems, space tugs, off-mining robotics, in-space manufacturing, a whole range of things. So much of that is driven by cooperation between a whole range of sectors, where there are agreements, there are commercial arrangements, there are legal arrangements. The opportunities for the legal profession to play its part are tantalizing, but the responsibilities are also significant. Because if we get it wrong, or if we use the wrong sort of toolboxes, then those wheels do not move. A failure by lawyers to acquire that space literacy, even if they don't want to pick up the Outer Space Treaty every day, but a failure to understand the interaction between whatever it is their client is doing and space, means that the risks will not be managed in an appropriate way. And that would be more than just unimportant. That would be unfortunate. So obviously, I've focused here on the commercial side, But of course, the international framework, and which is where Mark and I and Michael spend a lot of our work as well. I do a lot of work, for example, with the UN. The international level also informs that national framework. It also is relevant for any national space activity, and we can all understand why. So lawyers need to be also conversant with that. But the lawyers who have the benefit of learning space law at great places like North Dakota and Cleveland, if they become conversant with the issues, they will be as important. So I wouldn't put them above the engineers, Mark, but I'd certainly put them on the same level. They will be as important in that space ecosystem alongside space-savvy engineers and space-savvy bankers and space-savvy mariners and space-savvy farmers and space-savvy miners and many others. Not everybody has to be a unique space law specialist, but we need to, in a sense, in the practice of law, look up to the skies a lot more than perhaps we have in the past. That's why, in that context, the study of space law and the study of space policy is a crucial element in the proper education of lawyers to meet these challenges. And if I may say, I applaud Mark, I applaud Michael, I applaud all of those institutions who have taken up that mantle, have realized that responsibility, and are offering contemporary, practical, realistic, and focused study as part of this more broad education for lawyers. Certainly, if I was a student today, I'd be at visiting your universities and learning as much as I can from great professors such as the two of you. So I'll leave it at that. I hope I haven't gone too far over time, Mark, and I hope that sets the scene for my colleagues on the panel to then focus on the American. Thanks so much, and I'm happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Terrific, and we'll certainly have opportunity for those questions. I ask everyone to hold on to them until we come a little bit closer to the end of our hour. The need for space literacy. I've never heard that phrase before, but I like it. Let's move to Professor Dodge now. And Michael, this is an opportunity for you to explain your take and also your program and what you teach and who your students are there in North Dakota.
Sure thing, and thank you, Professor Freeland and Professor Sundahl. That was a great tee up, and I always get nervous when I go to conferences and Professor Freeland is there because he's so brilliant. I'm like, oh man, do I have the entire charter memorized? Let me just in case. But yeah, so it's a real honor to be on a panel with you guys. So I guess I'll talk about space law education from the sort of the U.S. perspective. In the United States, I'll start out generally, and then I can talk a little bit about my program and my history. In general, people in the United States obtaining their JD, which is their law degree, there's no such thing really as a major, right? So you get your JD, you get, everybody's a lawyer, right, at the end. Whether or not you pass the bar exam is another question for another panel, but at the end of the day, you're a lawyer. So if you want to specialize in something, you have to kind of really pursue it on your own. Or if you have a great fortune, you might find yourself at a place like the Global Space Law Center. There was a center where I received my certificate long ago that was federally funded, and I don't know its current funding status, but they still have an LLM program there. And in Nebraska and a few other places, Canada has McGill. These are places that you can go to get your sort of specialist levels of education, but most of the time, law students in this country pursue space law as one of many different things that they're taking a look at. It's not necessarily part of their core, but if it's integral to their own education, they seek it out. And in fact, when I started teaching at the University of Mississippi School of Law, where a new LLM program had been created. And I found that some of my law students, some of my JDs, we also had LLM students, obviously, but some of my JD students had come from all across the country, specifically because they wanted to learn space law. And I'm sure that Professor Sundahl is finding the same thing is probably true at Global Space Law Center. In fact, I know he is, because one of my former students here at UND decided that space law was for her and went to study under you at your law center there. So I know these kinds of discussions between citizens and law students in universities is becoming more and more common. So you really have to have a passion for it. And I think that passion is growing and expanding. And I saw a lot of that in Mississippi when I taught there, and I've seen a lot of that in North Dakota where I live now, that people are so passionate about space, and not just, I want to be an astronaut kind of passion, which many people still possess, but I want to be a space entrepreneur, or I want to be a regulator, or I want to be whatever. There are many different people with many different aspirations. And I think space is just growing and growing and growing. And I think Professor Freeland stated it very well, much more eloquently than I could, about the importance of space to modern civilization all across the world. And that's becoming very important in the United States in particular, where people are recognizing that their economy and their eventual jobs and positions that are available to them are increasingly tied to an understanding of outer space. And so they have to understand the space laws. Some of them, their lawyers, of course, need to know a little bit about space law depending on where they are, and that's becoming increasingly important. It's funny because when I first started doing this, when I was a student back in the day, I remember there were people, the first lawyers for SpaceX, for example, and we did interviews with them from time to time, and would speak with them at conferences. And they would say, they don't think of themselves as space lawyers. They think of themselves as lawyers, and they just happen to do things in outer space. I think for a lot of people, that's still the case around the world and in the United States. But originally, there was almost a stigma that if you call yourself a space lawyer, it means you're so pigeonholed that you can't really be of use to a company, but in doing the things that they do on a normal daily basis, like procurement or like employment law, any of the things that they need on a daily basis. But I think that is changing. I mean, I've sensed kind of a cultural shift in this country that more and more people are wanting to be identified as space lawyers, or at least as lawyers that are sort of space centric in what they do. And to my mind, space lawyer is as much right now an identity as it is a profession. And that's something I'm seeing a lot of in both law school settings and where I am now. So when I taught at a law school, I was teaching kind of a hybrid model where I had LLM students that were online, and I had campus students that were JDs. So I had a mixture of people who were working towards their law degree and people who already had one that were getting an advanced degree in air and space law. And that was a really great experience. I loved it. It was formative for me. These days, I'm at the University of North Dakota, whereas I like to call it God's forgotten country, which is a very, very cold place most of the year. Although right now it's still okay for another few days, I suppose. I don't know. October starts getting really bad, but anyway. So we've got amazingly, this place almost in the middle of nowhere is amazing in its history for its connection to outer space activities. So we train, for those who don't know, at our aerospace college here, we train a lot of the pilots that learn to fly in the United States and in other countries. A lot of Chinese pilots train here, for example, and pilots from all over Europe and the Middle East and elsewhere. And the founder of that college wanted to expand at one point, and somehow he got a hold of Buzz Aldrin, who came along with a bunch of other space experts. And Stephen, you're familiar with Joanne Gavrinowitz, who was also my mentor when I was a law student. And all of his people got together to form the Space Studies Department, which we still have today. So we're really fortunate to have this department. But what makes it kind of unique is it's not really a law school program. So I still have law students from the law school, UND's law school, and an assembly of military JAGs that, for example, are getting their space buff and coming over here to do that. But most of my students are actually engineers or mathematicians or astronomers or physics people. I have a mixture of all kinds of people from all kinds of fields. So space law education is really reaching into other areas too, not just to law students who are going to be the lawyers for SpaceX and Sierra Nevada and everywhere else, but for all of those other people that need to work with them. So Professor Freeland was talking about space literacy, and I'm really glad that he did, because that's one of the primary functions of what we do in our program. I tell students when they get here that we have a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary program. I'm the only lawyer here, but I've got a couple of astronomers and planetary scientists, a mathematician, a spacesuit designer, all kinds of other people with whom I'm working. And the point behind that is so that when they graduate, they have a generalized understanding of everything important in outer space, including space law. So whereas most of my students right now are not space lawyers, they leave with an understanding, or so it is hoped, of the basics of space law, so that they can know that when they're planning to build a module or when they're planning to do something with NASA or with Boeing or with Sierra Nevada or wherever they end up going, that they understand that there are rules that are important to them that they need to keep in mind during their planning phases. And it helps them, we hope, to communicate, which is one of the biggest things that we see right now, a need for this communication as the space economy and opportunities alongside it expand. So in terms of recent changes that I've seen, space law has grown really, really rapidly in the last 10, 20 years. And I think that, Professor Freeland and Professor Sundahl would probably agree with this, that they've seen quite a lot going on. While international space law has remained relatively stable, although there have been changes there too, domestic legislation all over the world is really just growing so fast. In the United States, for those who may not be familiar, Congress is quite fond of passing law after law after law. That's what they do, right? And they are very fond of that in the space world too. We've got committees that have been in existence since the age, in one form or the other, since right after Sputnik. And they are still churning out laws and regulations that are of great importance to the United States and its activities in outer space. So some changes that we've seen lately has been a very strong emphasis on commercial space. That has been something that policy-wise we've seen in this country going for quite a long time in the age. It's basically even before President Reagan, but it became a really fundamental aspect of his administration. And presidents of both political parties ever since have wanted to commercialize as many aspects of space as they can. So that's been continuing with policy, with regulation, with law. And Congress is really keeping pace, I think, maybe not to the satisfaction of all the commercial entities out there, but they're trying. They're much more rapidly evolving than in a lot of other fields. So I've seen a lot of emphasis on that. There's a lot of regulation that's going on right now, both with respect to orbital tourism and with respect to remote sensing in particular in this country. So those regimes are both kind of changing and shifting, mostly to make them more commercially viable and friendly, but also to make them more useful to the federal government so that they can start to get more and more of their services provided by private entities and commercial entities so that they can focus their own efforts on deep space exploration. That's one of the things that NASA is trying to do. And in fact, I think we just saw that they just divided their human space centers into two different kinds of space centers, like one for the low Earth orbit stuff and one for what they're really wanting to focus on, which is Mars and Artemis. And that's a role that they intend private organizations to fill to the greatest extent possible. So that's why we've seen this long road stemming from, basically the second President Bush and COTS and all of that, all the way up through the modern times in which we're living now, where there's a greater and greater emphasis on commercial. And I suppose the other thing I've seen a greater emphasis on right now is in military space. For better or for worse, depending on how you want to think about that. That is always growing. It has always been a predominant factor in why nations wanted to be in space from the very beginning, from the USSR and the USA. A lot of that had to do with remote sensing, reconnaissance, national security planning, and so on. That hasn't changed. Our dependency on it has. We've become much more dependent upon these things these days. So as Professor Freeland was saying, a day without space would be disastrous. How would we go back to living the way that we did before that? But especially in the United States, with the creation of the Space Force, we have seen and are continuing to see a greater emphasis on the military aspects and aspirations of outer space. UND, in fact, became, I think, the first university in the United States to form an MOU with Space Force not that long ago. And I think they have several others planned throughout the country that they're going to go about doing this with over the next couple of years. And the idea behind that is to cooperate in finding ways of enhancing our understanding of military space and the military usages of outer space. So that could be very, very interesting indeed. And I suppose, I guess I'll cap this off with a discussion of where the students are kind of going. My students have really gone everywhere. So again, if you get a JD, when I was teaching at a law school, I mean, you disperse and you kind of go anywhere. I've met space lawyers at the EPA, at FAA, at Fish and Wildlife, wherever. There are people that go all over the place in federal agencies, if that's what they're interested in, or working for private entities, satellite companies, remote sensing entities, even a lot of the new space startups. And the fact of the matter is they do what they can to be involved in space as they can and how they can. And that's becoming increasingly easy for them because a lot of these companies need people to do things for outer space. Most of the time, these things are, as I said earlier, normal lawyer stuff. You need to be able to do contracts and employment law and procurement and all the other things, just with the space twist. So I'm seeing a lot of students from law go in that direction. I'm seeing a lot of my other students who are engineers and mathematicians and things. They are working for Sierra Nevada and SpaceX and NASA and Boeing and all the others, the old and new space actors alike. Some of them are going to working in industry, and some of them, as I mentioned earlier, are going to Professor Sundahl's Institute after they finish their master's degree here, because I've had a few that kind of fell in love with space law. It kind of cast a spell, I guess, as I think a lot of us in this room would probably agree, and some people really fall for that. So that's kind of the basics. I know I've been a bit loquacious and quick there, so I'll sort of stop here and let Professor Sundahl dictate where he wants to go next.
Excellent. I will take full advantage of my dictatorial abilities here, but thank you both for giving such expansive and thorough overviews of the nature of space law and your experiences so far. We'd like to drill down now to a little greater detail and speak about those concrete aspects of space law and what we are doing as space lawyers and why it's important and what are some of the hot issues these days. I will start out by saying that space law is actually a long-standing discipline. It's gone back to, the first book was written in the 30s, 1932, I think, by Vladimir Mondal, and then the first treaties in the 60s and the 70s establishing basic tenets of international space law, that we shall not station weapons of mass destruction in orbit, that we shall not appropriate the moon and other celestial bodies as the 51st state or another province of China, that states will be liable for damage caused, that we will register our space objects so that everyone knows what everyone else is doing, that we will operate with due regard to the interests of other states and we won't interfere, that we will rescue each other's astronauts and return any lost spacecraft to the launching state. So those are some basic concepts that are covered by international law. But Article 6 of the UN Outer Space Treaty says then that states are also required to authorize and supervise, that is, regulate their nationals, their private activity. And that's what has opened the door to private regulation that Professors Freeland and Dodge have talked about. And so we have private regulations, current domestic regulations about launch licenses, about operating telecommunication satellites, about taking pictures from space. Think of Google Earth, remote sensing. But now we have, and those are very traditional activities in space, but now we have we're going to have private space stations, tourism, on-orbit repair and servicing and refueling, and mining. A lot of new areas, and we need regulation for all of them, not over-regulation, but some reasonable regulation. So that's giving you a taste of all the different areas of space law, and I'd like our panelists to maybe focus in a little bit more on those specific areas and what we're doing as space lawyers. And I'd like to start with our students and have them describe their experience briefly, give each of you 3 or 4 minutes to just talk about your experience and in particular what areas and topics you've enjoyed studying. And so I'll do reverse alphabetical order here and start with Stephen Robeson.
All right, first off the bat, yes. So I started with you, Professor Sundahl, at Cleveland Marshall, and then I actually focused more on the national security aspect of it. So went in and did more looking at different types of weapons. And then I actually went and got my LLM from Georgetown for national security and just basically took all of the classes I could possibly take in national security and then focus each one of those with the space aspect of it. So you had different orbit positions. How do we like mitigate different weapons? What are the reverberating effects of it? So you go into all your international humanitarian law, any other like law of war, and all of those where everything else used to be more on the ground. I focused what is that, but then in space, and how do we actually apply that? So it's kind of going from, instead of just focusing strictly on space law, is understanding weapons. And so how Professor Freeland said, the space literacy. I actually focused on understanding what is a downlink jam, what is an uplink jam, what is cyber warfare, and actually understanding the science or the history of that, and then took space law and applied it to it.
Terrific. And I should have mentioned that Stephen went on and earned his LLM at Georgetown University, one of the handful of law schools that teach space law. There aren't that many out there, but Georgetown is one, and learned from the great NASA lawyer, Steve Mermina, and the other well-known attorney working for Secure World Foundation, Christopher Johnson. So he has had the benefit of a number of space lawyers looking after him. Scott.
So first of all, or the behind the scenes work for everyone with the conference, and Mark, you know how grateful I am for the invitation. So thank you. So my background, I'm actually a Canadian living and working in the United States, and I went to Cleveland Marshall College of Law as a student, and in fact, Professor Sundahl actually approached me and said, "Hey, I've got this new course I'm offering, and maybe you'd like to take it." And so sure enough, I took this space law course, which was the first time it was being offered. And so my comments, I think we'll start from there. And I'd like to just kind of hopefully at the end offer a few suggestions going forward, not directly to any center in particular, but you'll get the gist of it at the end. But what I really appreciated most being an older student was the freedom to think creatively. And I think space law really lent itself to that. You could meet as a group. Hey, here's some treaties. Let's talk about it. And you know, the world is your ocean, and so is the universe. So you know, just go and think creatively and come up with something. So I took it upon myself, and I was thinking about, okay, well, what if someone is born in outer space? So that was sort of where my whole interest came from. And then once you start into that research, okay, well, so why is that? And then that led me to United States constitutional issues and things of that nature. And then suddenly through this whole process, I realized, wow, this is huge. This is expansive. I know, you know, obviously nothing about all of this, and yet there was a place for this. There was a place for what I was writing. There was a place for this discussion, and it was what I wanted to do, and that was my passion. It was that experience to openly discuss, collectively consider, and research possibilities and topics that really piqued my interest. And that's what, you know, school is supposed to do, in my opinion. You can go on and you will have a career and so on, but you know, you need to find really what your passion is. That, of course, led me to University of Nebraska for their Masters of Law program in space, cyber, and telecommunications. And there, wow, it was a whole series of courses. And this, I think, relates very directly to Professor Freeland's comments about studying space law. And I put the emphasis on study. The breadth, creating space citizens, so to speak, having to have the background understanding of so many disciplines. And so it really struck me. Now, I'm going to make a connection to earlier today, and if anyone was able to catch Colonel Collins' comments or any of the cybersecurity panel, Colonel Collins was keynote. I had to do a lot with leadership and experts don't know it all. And so just to kind of make some of those connections and apply it to law school here, I feel like at the JD level, you are going to learn the law and you're going to go out and practice, but let's not hand someone a set of treaties and say, okay, here, go practice some space law, you know, try to figure it out and apply them, that sort of thing. And so this is where I think that understanding that attorneys at this point, and prior to this, but need to be the leaders in this in many ways, to have that in-depth understanding, to make the connections and not just make necessarily a legal conclusion to suit whoever needs to be pleased, but to make it a considered, thought through conclusion. And this touches such a wide variety of areas. If you're advising the President of the United States or military staff, and suddenly a satellite, one of your telecommunication satellites, was taken out, and there goes your banking system, is that an act of war? Can you retaliate? Where's the carnage? Where is the maiming, and so on? And you can't just have a knee-jerk reaction. You need to have, in my opinion, a lot of these background disciplines and connections, international law, commercial law, of course, space legislation, treaty, national security law, air law. All of those connections need to come into play. Now, you may limit yourself to a particular field. Maybe you just want to deal with some contracts or some insurance type of work. But I think in connecting it to the idea of leadership, these attorneys can't know it all. They are not experts, in my opinion, in everything, and they need to learn as much as they can. And that then leads to fostering collaboration, reaching out. Is this a very small community? Yes, it is. It's growing, it sure is, but it's still tight and it's difficult to get into. And so, pushing at it, doing what I can, becoming involved however I can, whenever I can, that's my life path at this moment. But the LLM program facilitated a lot of that. They had guest speakers from the various agencies to fill in gaps that maybe a particular professor wanted filled in. They had conferences. Students were taken to DC to attend conferences. The school itself offered conferences. They made alumni feel welcome and wanted their input all through and even after. And I attend and I absorb and I learn. And everyone, or the panel, are teachers and professors, and I love nothing more than that. But I think that my suggestion would be for any center, for any program, to have, and I went through, for example, a concentration in labor and employment law, which meant that I took various courses within that realm. And I think that a similar type of structure would go very far. Having a course steeped in international law, obviously a space law, national legislation law, international legislation law, arms, trade, GATT agreements. You can't cover it all, I understand, but some thought, I think, in participatory events, getting people involved, having experts also share in their lectures and their knowledge, and setting up a structure to, at the JD level, put people out into the workforce even that much more prepared, and not necessarily having to have an advanced degree. I think that's really one of the keys. So with that, thank you. I'll yield and let others have some comments.
Thank you. Terrific insights there. And we were just talking about creating a series of who are space lawyers, and inviting more space lawyers to participate and meet with our students. So your comments are well taken. I'd like to move now to Hailey Hillsman and ask Hailey, who's a current student of mine, to tell us whether she's met other space lawyers and what her experience has been and what she's been doing as a member of the Research Council. I'm going to ask you to take a few minutes to address that, Hailey, and then I'm just going to open up the floor to all of our participants and let you all ask what it is you'd like to hear about. So Hailey, the floor is yours.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor. I'm very glad to be here. And I think in talking about my journey, I'm actually going to end up answering Mike Rand's question that he has posed in our Q&A. I'm originally from Georgia, and I'm now a student at Cleveland Marshall College of Law in Cleveland, Ohio, with Professor Sundahl. And I specifically came to Cleveland Marshall to have the opportunity to be a part of the Global Space Law Center, because there are not many programs around the United States who are putting that focus on space law. You can go to pretty much any law school and take courses that are going to help you in transactional law, or courses that are going to help you in labor and employment, like Scott was talking about, or other various areas of law. But there are not many law schools who are taking all of that and focusing it on space law to where you're really utilizing your skills to be an effective space lawyer. And Cleveland Marshall was one of those schools that was doing that. As Professor Sundahl said, we are the only global space law center in the country, and I'm very proud to be a part of that. In Georgia, I was a high school science teacher for 6 years, and taught mostly environmental science and human anatomy and physiology. And in teaching environmental science, I really tried to incorporate space into my classroom as much as possible, because so many citizens, perhaps around the world, but definitely in the United States, do not understand the impact that space can have even on our planet here on Earth. And so I really tried to impose that upon my students, and to have them see that we're not just here alone, that the universe is constantly in some degree out to get us, and we have to be prepared for that. And I think Mike ran to your point about your question, what are some of the barriers? That's kind of it. You have to go to these programs who are focusing on space law. Yes, there are other ways to break into it, but if this is something you're really wanting to study in school, or in a law school as you're getting your Juris Doctorate, there are not many schools throughout the United States who are putting this focus on this really important area of the law. I know Scott talked about it's a little bit difficult to get into right now as you're coming out of law school. But in my opinion, and I would be curious to know what our professors think, I think there's going to be a shift in that at some point as we continue to see some of the issues in space law crop up. There will be new issues coming down the pipe daily, monthly, yearly, and we need lawyers who are going to be ready and prepared to take on and tackle these issues, and come up with creative and innovative solutions to the new frontier, the new problems that we're going to be experiencing in outer space. I really thought getting into law school that I would be very interested in some of the environmental concerns that would come with outer space, or especially us returning back to the moon, or exploring new areas of outer space. But as Professor Sundahl mentioned earlier, my focus shifted to space tourism. And I've done a lot of my research in the regulatory regime for suborbital tourism under the FAA. And now we're kind of shifting our focus to orbital tourism as well. And even beyond that, even when we start seeing hotels on the moon, or our new module that's going to be built onto the International Space Station, what's that going to look like? How do we find this happy medium of regulating these industries to where we can provide safe space exploration for citizens while still driving innovation in these fields? So that is what I am doing with my time in law school, and I'm very fortunate to be a part of this program and to have sat in some of the rooms with so many fantastic people working in this area, not just within the law, but within space in general. And very happy to be here with all of you today.
Thank you, Hailey, and we're fortunate to have you as part of the Global Space Law Center, and you've done interesting work. And that's, if there is one aspect of the Global Space Law Center, I think, that distinguishes it from other programs, is that I really make an effort to involve our students directly in ongoing legal initiatives, so that they can see that they have the ability to shape space law and the changes that are taking place. and also work with them to publish. Hailey will be publishing her second piece in the near future. So that is one thing I strive to do. I see a question about advice, and this is probably a question that's held by many of you. What do we recommend if you want to get into space law and work in the field? First of all, go to one of the law schools that teaches space law. And just by doing that, you will distinguish yourself, because there aren't many law schools that do. Therefore, there are very few that are trained in space law. And there are positions out there, and they are growing. And network, network, network. As Lee Scott said, it is a relatively small family. And who you know can very much help to get into the field. So take control of your own destiny and be determined. And even if you don't get your dream job right out of law school, opportunities will open up. Stephen, did you want to add anything as far as advice for law students and how they might enter the field?
Thank you, Mark, and apologies to everybody. I will have to leave at the turn of the hour for another meeting. My day is just starting, and you're all going off for a quiet beer afterwards at the end of your day, which is great. I agree with everything that's been said. What fantastic presentations from everybody. Thank you. It's a privilege to sit on the panel with all of you and listen to your thoughts. And I think there's a fundamental message that we're all saying, that be a sponge. You know, as I tried to say, and everybody has elaborated, space is relevant for so many things. Even if you're not going to pick up the treaties every day, even if you're not going to talk about space in the specifics every day, space is relevant for all walks of life. Space is relevant for all sorts of activities. And I think, you know, we're all happy that I use the expression space literacy. Let's start a space literacy for all campaign in the United States, because I think that's what it's about. In the remaining minutes before I've got to go, I see a question there about the balance between regulation, between innovation and regulation. I've had the privilege of advising maybe a dozen governments now on the drafting of or reform of their national space law. And the important issues there are, it is a balance. Every country will have a certain risk profile. Every country will have certain ambitions, capabilities, industrial development. Every country will be parties to various international obligations, particularly the treaties. And so when I talk to governments about what they want to do with their national law, either develop one or reform their existing one, I ask them all the same questions at the beginning, but the answers are very different. And therefore the answers then tailor the way that you move forward, because every government will want to do something with its national framework that best meets its own national interests. It is a balance. It's a balance between safety and international obligations, and there's a liability risk for the state, even if private entities go to space. There's a whole range of issues on, if you like, the left-hand side of the ledger that you need to look at. And on the right-hand side of the ledger, it's, of course, encouraging innovation and industry. Mark mentioned, pardon me, the Australian Space Agency, which was established in 2018. I've been appointed by the government to sit on the advisory board. And the Australian Space Agency has particular KPIs. That is to triple the size of the economy, the space economy, and to add another 20,000 jobs into space. And so our space agency is very industry focused and very revenue focused. And so the balance there is in our national law, because I've been involved in the reform of it, is to try to streamline it and make it user friendly. But still, Australia and every other country like the United States needs to remain good space citizens and comply with their obligations. The United States does a wonderful job in that. And I'd like to say so does my country. So it is a balance. That's why when people say, well, we should have harmonized national law, I think, with all due respect to the people who say that, that's a misunderstanding of the fact that every country has to pass laws in its best interests, pardon me. They'll often deal with similar subject matter, and part of that is handed down by the obligations that Mark said under Article 6 of this treaty. and they'll obviously deal with authorization and regulation in their own way, but they'll have other add-ons as well, depending on what they're trying to achieve. So it is a balance. I sincerely apologize that I have to leave now for another meeting. I wish I could stay and listen to the colleagues, but Mark, please send me details of what everybody's said and I'll see the recording. Let me just take this opportunity to thank everybody, Scott, Stephen, Michael, Hailey, and of course, Mark. Thank you for allowing me to be part of this discussion. I'm sure that people have appreciated everything you've said, and I'm really, really grateful. And I look forward, Michael and Mark, to coming and give some classes in your law programs as well, if you'll have me. And following you, Scott and Hailey and Stephen, in your careers, please stay in touch. Apologies, and I'll say goodbye from Australia, and thank you again. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I think I can speak on behalf of everyone that we are very grateful to have you here and to hear your words. And we will follow up, and we will call you to participate in further events as well. So take good care, my friend, and we will be in touch.
Thank you. It'll be a pleasure, and stay safe, everybody. Bye-bye.
Take care now. Daniel, do we have a few more minutes to continue with questions?
Yes, you can take a few more minutes.
Okay, excellent. I think I'll hand the reins over to Professor Dodge. There's a question here about why do more law schools not offer space law? And do you think they will?
It's a very good question. To the latter question, yes, I think more and more will start teaching space law. But I mean, I think as Professor Sundahl knows from his own experience, a lot of the time these programs are generated from the personal passions of the law scholar that's involved in the field here. So like some of the time we'll have a long-term investment by government funds or state funds in a program like the one that was taught in Mississippi at the time I was a law student. And now we've got the Global Space Law Center as a new example of a great new center to study space law. So I think that part of this is an awareness issue for people who aren't super aware of what space law is. Part of it is convincing for law professors to convince their colleagues and their deans and the money people, as it were, that it's important to focus on this area because it is so integral to the future of really of everyone, but especially of the United States and of its economy and of the next generation of attorneys. So I think that as we see more and more law schools recognizing that, as we are, they're going to start creating more and more centers, or at least allowing more and more professors who are interested in this topic to teach courses in this. So for some things like the LLM program that I taught at Ole Miss, when I came back to it, not as a student, but as a teacher, one of the reasons we were able to do that is because LLM programs make money. And that is a way to generate revenue for the university. And they thought, okay, well, we'll do that. Even though that university had a decades-long history in space law, remote sensing and air law, it was an uphill battle convincing people that there needed to be a program for that. And I don't know what Professor Sundahl's experiences have been, but I'm sure that there were some unique challenges along the way. So I think that that's one of the issues. And yeah, I do think more and more will catch up to that. One other thing I wanted to bring up with the earlier question about challenges for students pursuing space law, people who are interested in that as a profession. One of the biggest barriers, I think, is sort of a mental block or a barrier that I've noticed that some students will put on themselves, which I definitely recommend that you remove. A lot of people, if this is a problem for you, a lot of people think that in order to be a space lawyer, you have to immediately move into NASA, or you have to immediately move into SpaceX, which is just not the case. A lot of the people who work in space law worked in many other areas and many other agencies or corporations. I mean, they might have worked in corporate affairs at Target or something, and they just happen to be very interested in space law. So don't let that be a barrier to you. You can cut your teeth in other kinds of agencies, other kinds of law firms, for example, and then move into it as needed. And especially because of what I was saying earlier, a lot of what space lawyers actually do is contracts or employment law or other matters like that you need to know anyway, that you will be taught anyway as a law student. So don't think of yourself as being limited if you can't start out immediately in your dream job. Just think of it as a goal that you need to continue pursuing. And good on you if you can get there immediately. That's wonderful. But for a lot of us, you have to kind of get there by hopping positions, and you'll get there eventually. It's very few of us are lucky enough to be able to get up in the morning and look at a booklet of treaties and discuss the nuances of due regard or harmful contamination and what those things mean. And I count myself as fortunate as one of those people who can do that, because I can discuss that with my students. But for most people, if you're a practicing attorney, you'll get there eventually. Just stay passionate and you'll get there. So that's just my 2 cents.
Excellent advice. And for those who are interested in space law, you don't necessarily have to attend one of our institutions. This is a shameless plug, but my space law course is offered at Cleveland Marshall, will be offered next in fall 2022, and it's open to anyone, even non-lawyers or non-law students. But certainly if you're a law student in another school, you can enroll and take my 3 credit hour space law course. So if you're interested, please reach out to me. I would like to give the floor to Stephen Robeson, who has his hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and the other thing, so going back to why some of the law schools don't have the programs, I was going to say, actually bring the initiative to your own school. So when I first started at Cleveland Marshall, the space law class, you couldn't take it unless you were a 2L, because you have your core curriculum for your 1L year. And that really irritated me. So I actually worked with Professor Sundahl, and we made the Space Law Society. And I've actually seen there's a lot of schools that have space law societies that you can then invite speakers, you can do the networking, you can actually start that without having a dedicated program to it. So that is like something, I think it just, the way I did it was I looked at the school's guidelines, regulations for it, put together a proposal, got Professor Sundahl to work with me, even made a logo and pitched it. And then it allowed for then 1Ls to start working on space law and actually working with the research center, and then moving forward, it kind of made a pipeline for us. So you could also do that and bring it to your school.
Absolutely. Thank you for that great idea, Stephen. I see we've come to the end of our time. Are there any further questions?
I don't see any further questions. I think you've all answered. Thank you very much for your answers. I myself learned a lot about this, and I think you all were great. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having us, and I want to thank our panelists again. I'm very proud of my students, and I'm very happy to have my friend Professor Michael Dodge here. So if you're interested in space law, reach out to me, reach out to Professor Dodge. We would love to see you pursue the field. So thank you all. Thank you, Stephen, Scott, Hailey, of course, the new president of the Space Law Society. I appreciate all you've done for the field, and I know you're destined for great things. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
We'll
Professor.
have another full day tomorrow, so we hope to see some of you there. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.